and hatred. The Great Division of India. Good evening, I'm Bill Cameron. 40 years ago tonight, one of the most enormous, painful events in the 20th century was beginning to come to an end. It was a death, the death of the Raj, the bedrock of the British Empire, and it was the birth of two nations, India and Pakistan. New kinds of nations, former colonies now becoming adult and independent, and in doing that, sounding the theme that was to dominate the rest of the 20th century. A huge birth, and in many ways horrible. Maybe 250,000 people murdered, maybe 500,000, maybe 1 million. It was an overwhelming event that has been hidden from us here by time, distance, indifference. But as you look at the old pictures of the dead and the wounded, it doesn't seem so foreign. And the deaths of hundreds of Canadians on an Air India plane near Ireland 2 years ago has proven that the passions of that old country can reach here now. 40 years ago, the exhaustion of a world war and the demands of the people of India were pushing the British out. Nobody could know what the future would be like, except that it would mean the birth of two modern nations in hope and hatred. August 16th, 1946, Calcutta. British troops stare unbelievingly at streets smeared with blood and scattered with corpses. 5,000 of them, victims of the new plague of India, the mad sickness of sectarian murder. The British prayed the sickness would not spread because there was so much India to be infected. A whole subcontinent, 1.5 million square miles, 400 million people, a fifth of the world's population. For almost 200 years, the British had ruled this enormous place. India, the British said, was the jewel in their crown. Indian soldiers kept the peace. Indian princes obeyed the Raj. The British Empire was greater than Rome's, and nowhere greater than here. For 2 centuries. But now the British could feel the religious divisions of India becoming poisonous. The Hindus, 260 million of them in 1946, bound by caste and custom, worshippers of a lavish constellation of gods and goddesses and demigods, expressed and celebrated in pictures, stories, costumes, songs, and parades. The Muslims, 100 million of them in 1946, followers of Islam, an austere religion from the Arabian desert, with one God, in almost every way the opposite of Hinduism, as if each religion had been purposely designed to offend the followers of the other. And allied then to the Hindus, the 6 million Sikhs, worshippers again of one creator named Truth, always armed and proud and ready for battle. Historian Stanley Wolpert says the religious divisions were and are wide, fundamental, savage.
There's a sense of we-they. There's a sense of they don't understand us, they never can, they never will, because they're of a different faith. There is a fear, and then there's a hatred that emerges as soon as the charge of religion in danger, din, or they've attacked our women, or they have done something that has polluted our place of worship.
And against all this, against these primal passions that were pulling the nation apart, there was one force binding it together. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a lawyer who had spent 20 years in South Africa organizing Indian laborers in the teeth of the white settlers. Gandhi had fought the settlers, and in India the British, with satyagraha, non-violent civil disobedience, a willingness to suffer for truth. That went to the root of India. It made him a living saint. He knew it. He used it. Jawaharlal Nehru was India's leader in waiting, a brilliant politician. He became head of the Hindu-dominated Congress Party at the age of 40, naturally, as if he'd come into it as an inheritance. And because this was India, Nehru's opponent was also Nehru's absolute polar opposite, Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the Muslim League, a harsh man who had refined his life so that it contained almost nothing but politics and one political goal. And that was Pakistan, the 4 northwestern provinces that had Muslim majorities, along with Bengal and Assam in the northeast, were, Jinnah insisted, to become Pakistan, an independent, sovereign Muslim nation. In Britain, the Second World War was over. There was a sense that the empire was over too. Britain felt like a smaller country with no more appetite for imperial glory. In the election of August 1945, Britain turned its back on Churchill and the empire he had defended. The new Prime Minister was Clement Attlee, who wanted to be done with India as soon as possible. Attlee sent out 3 senior cabinet ministers to draw up an agreement for Indian independence, but the Indians would not agree, not with the British and certainly not with each other. The Congress Party and the Muslim League wrestled each other over every clause and subclause, and in the north the murders were beginning.
First pictures of the grim
The Indian ground was shifting under Britain's feet, and many of Britain's senior strategists were telling London it was time to get out, with dignity if possible, if necessary without it. Someone drew up a Dunkirk plan. British women and children were to be evacuated, he said, and then British civilians and then British troops, province by province, until India was left to itself.
I mean, the government in London, of course, was prepared to snatch at any solution by this stage because they realized that control was passing out of British hands.
Historian Hugh Tinker had served in the Indian Army. At that point, he was a member of the Indian Civil Service.
And one has to remember that while all this was going on, the British forces, which at the height of the war had numbered 5.5 million men and women, by now had been demobilized to a point that there were about 1 million left in the armed forces. And this 1 million soldiers and others had to police vast new areas of the world. So any idea that the British could take a firm line in India was really out of the question.
The British Prime Minister turned to his own polar opposite, a man as unlike Clement Attlee as Nehru was from Jinnah. Lord Mountbatten of Burma, cousin of King George VI, a military hero, supreme commander of the Allied forces Southeast Asia, including India, during the war. Handsome, charming, vain, clever, an instinctive actor who knew the uses of pageantry, who was very nearly a pageant all by himself. Queen Victoria's great-grandson must have known he was born to be Viceroy of India, even if he was to be the last one. Still,
when Mr. Attlee asked me to take on this job, he rather took my breath away. This wasn't something that could be decided straight off, and in fact, we had several meetings about it. I asked to see the king. As King Emperor, he kept very close touch with Indian affairs. I pointed out to him that the chances of complete failure were very great, and it would be bad for him to have a member of his family fail. He replied, "But think how good it would be for the monarchy if you succeed."
in fact, Mountbatten had no doubt he would do just that, organize and execute the withdrawal of Great Britain from a subcontinent that was very nearly at war with itself, efficiently, quickly, and with style. Others had almost equal hopes. The Earl of Listowel was the last British Secretary of State for India.
Mountbatten sympathized with Indian nationalism, was in favor of constitutional advance and ultimate independence, and was on very good terms with the Indian leaders already when he was being Supreme Commander of Southeast Asia during the war. He had got to know Nehru and was a good friend.
The scene is North Holt Airfield. The occasion, the departure of Lord Mountbatten of Burma, who was leaving for India with his wife.
Mountbatten wanted his own plane, and got it. He wanted the right to negotiate on his own without reporting to cabinet, and got that. London simply wanted out of India.
Everyone in Britain, I'm certain, wishes the Viceroy all possible success in India.
Calcutta, then Decca, then Bihar, Ahmedabad, Lahore, the rioting and killing spread. Mounds of bodies blocked traffic in India's major cities. Mountbatten landed in Delhi on March 22nd, 1947, just before the rains after months of drought. Against the rivalries and hatreds of India, he had only one tool, himself. He embodied the residual authority of the British Raj. The days when Britain could command here were over. But Louis Lord Mountbatten had moral authority, the right to negotiate and persuade. And if that rested on his ability to impress, in the end on theater, that was Mountbatten's long suit. His installation as viceroy was the grandest in history, and the first in history to be captured on film.
Mountbatten was probably the greatest exponent of public relations of his day. If he hadn't been a highly successful defense chief, he could have been an industrial tycoon, he could have been a political boss, he could have been anything you like, because he had this capacity for public relations and really convincing people.
Hello. We heard you were giving a party.
Noblesse oblige.
Don't mind our dropping by.
Having established his regality, Mountbatten could charm democratically. In a British television dramatized biography of Mountbatten, the viceroy and his wife crash a party given by Nehru. The two of them just pop in. Nehru is captivated, captured.
Yes, there was.
During the war.
Well, that makes two of us.
Good for you.
He really was like that graceful, that effective. Alan Campbell Johnson was Mountbatten's press attaché.
Mountbatten always had a great belief that human personality was an important factor in all politics, and indeed in military matters. And he was very anxious to form his own appraisal of these men. He was determined, whatever did happen, that it would be an agreement by discussion and not an award. And so he entered into a very intensive series of negotiations with the leaders by one meeting after another.
The Punjab and East Bengal, the plague of mad murder was spreading. The cities were on fire. In Delhi, Mountbatten talked constantly, almost desperately, till the volume of his words was overwhelming. Talked to the Sikhs, to Nehru and the Congress Party, talked most of all to the Muslims.
He constantly juggled words as well as people in ways that made it almost impossible for anyone to catch their breath long enough to find out what exactly they had said or what exactly was being committed to.
He talked to Gandhi, who had a kind of moral veto over any settlement. In a way, Gandhi was like Mountbatten himself, a form of spiritual Indian viceroy. He worked endlessly on Nehru, the Congress leader. Nehru still insisting on a united India, but beginning to understand the advantages of leading an India without the Muslim League. And especially without Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah would not compromise. He would have nothing less than an independent Pakistan. There was no room for negotiation. In the mind of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, there was nothing to negotiate about. He may have been the first person Mountbatten ever met who was completely immune to Mountbatten's charm. Not even Lady Edwina could move him. He smiled his small, cool smile and gave nothing.
The relationship with Jinnah was cold because Jinnah's negotiating techniques were not what I call associated with charm. I mean, he didn't operate on that basis. He was a reserved. He held himself aloof from everybody, and to that extent, negotiating with was very difficult.
India is a triangle, but to the northeast and northwest, the triangle juts out, and it was those two areas Jinnah demanded for Muslim Pakistan. In the east, in Bengal, there were many Hindus, but they were concentrated around the large port city of Calcutta. On the other side of the subcontinent, in the Punjab, the Muslim majority was concentrated in the west. Mixed in, but tending towards the east, was India's Sikh minority, and the Sikhs wanted no part of the Muslims or of Pakistan. Mountbatten debated all this with Jinnah.
He argued there must be partition. Otherwise, as a minority community, the Muslims would be swamped in Hindu India. Right, I said. Then by the same argument, the two provinces you want in Pakistan with large non-Muslim minorities will also have to be partitioned. Oh no, you can't do that. Punjabi unity and Bengali unity are much more important than Hindu-Muslim differences. In that case, I said, surely Indian unity is much more important than Hindu-Muslim differences. Oh no, said Jinnah, we must have Pakistan. And so it went on. A circular argument, round and round the mulberry bush. I never met anybody who could say no so persistently and so effectively.
And the killing went on. Mountbatten and his wife went to the northwest. If the Viceroy of India still believed that the nation could stay whole, the belief must have died on this journey. Maybe it died on a ridge near the Afghan border. When Mountbatten and his wife faced 10,000 angry tribesmen waving guns and calling for their own nation. The tribesmen were convinced of Mountbatten's courage, and he was convinced partition was inevitable. At the Viceregal Palace in Delhi, there was little talk now of a united India. The British had conceded it, the Hindus were coming to realize it. It was a question not of whether Pakistan, but of how much.
This was a realization which had been growing on me almost from the moment I came out here. I could sense a real tragedy just round the corner if we didn't act very fast. Civil war in its worst form. Beside that, partition, much as so many of us hated it, now seemed a much lesser evil.
To Northolt comes India's Viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten. He has arrived in this country for consultations with the cabinet.
May 18th, 1947. Mountbatten has taken 2 months to work out a rough plan for independence. He now needs final agreement from the British. It's a historic moment. A British nobleman arrives in London to ask for Britain's last great imperial decision.
Only 12 months now remain in which to complete the transfer of power to the Indians.
Without ceremony, the cabinet agrees. June 3rd, 1947, Delhi. Time is running very short, and if there's to be a deal, it will have to be signed now. But it's still not settled. The Congress Party and the Sikhs say they will agree to Pakistan, but to a smaller one than the Muslims want. But Jinnah has been elusive. Even at the last minute, Mountbatten cannot be sure of his agreement. Mountbatten puts the question.
Last night, I also had a long and informative discussion with Mr. Jinnah, during which he gave me certain assurances which satisfy me. Well, this must be a unique moment. We all seem to be in agreement.
At that moment, it must have seemed that the killing might end, that the plague might be cured, that this agreement among these men might end the war their followers were fighting in the streets and fields of their country. Gandhi could help, or he could certainly harm. If he did not approve, he could kill the agreement. He'd never liked the idea of partition, and he had that moral veto over the future of his country. What Gandhi said was heard and was obeyed.
When he came in immediately after the leaders had reached agreement, we were very worried, or Mountbatten was. And the little man came in and sat with him and said nothing. And all he did was to write on the back of an envelope. He said, "You will not expect me," he said, "on my day of silence to say anything that would embarrass you," and so forth. And what it meant was, of course, that he had opted out.
When we return, blood and freedom.
And breathe easier, and the hurting, stop.
Tristan drains all 8 sinus cavities.
In the rubble, future independent Indians and Pakistanis prepared for their future. The provisional government in Delhi was supposed to keep the country going for a year until independence, but it was on the point of collapse. The British moved the crucial date from a year away to 10 weeks away.
One of the most difficult features of the situation was how were we to keep that interim government going while the partition process was taking place. It was true to say that after the 3rd of June, it was virtually impossible to get that regime working. The essence of this agreement was to move quickly. It wasn't an option to stay on You know, it wasn't the kind of situation where you could have a sort of seminar and discuss it all and think it through. You had to move. The consequence was to move quickly and to stay moving.
Item 323.
The assets of Imperial India were carved up and parceled out. 80% for the new India, 20% for Pakistan. You take this, we take that.
But 80% of the assets should go to India, 20 to Pakistan.
It would be criminal to break up the set. We'll toss a coin. Heads for gold.
Gold for India. Now, see that the cushions, harnesses, and bridles...
That's everything.
Except for the
Viceroy's post horn.
Cicero Radcliffe, sir.
Mountbatten imported a London lawyer to perform the most excruciating job of all.
Your sole task is to establish the new boundaries. Until...
Radcliffe knew almost nothing about India, nothing about the physical, cultural, and ethnic boundaries the new frontiers would have to accommodate. And Radcliffe knew he needed at least a year.
You have exactly 5 weeks.
God. So the British lawyers drew their quick frontiers in secret to avoid complaints. Lines that cut links that had lasted 1,000 years, cut across properties, down rivers, through cities. For months, millions of people simply did not know where they were, and many began to run in fear. Each line stranded tens of thousands of people on the wrong side. Hindus in Muslim areas, Muslims where the Hindus and Sikhs could reach them. The new boundaries seemed to free the hatreds. The killers now felt they had permission to kill.
The corpses that were left to rot literally were so bad that soldiers had to be paid extra stipends to put on gloves and masks and haul away dead bodies and burn them en masse.
On August 13th, 1947, Mountbatten drove through the streets of Karachi to celebrate the birth of Pakistan. Muhammad Ali Jinnah had his new Muslim state, but the borders of his new state were drowning in blood.
The scene in Delhi was typical of hundreds of towns throughout the vast territory that was about to become the Dominion of India.
The next day, in the old capital of the British Raj, the leader of the Congress Party spoke to his country-to-be.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
People set out for new homelands that summer. As many as 1 million of them died. Sir Ian Scott was Mountbatten's deputy private secretary.
Karachi, where I then was, the Hindus from Upper Sindh came down overnight train to Karachi and went straight into the docks and onto a ship to take them to Bombay. One day, the ship had a breakdown. It wasn't there when the train arrived. The Hindus were taken off the train and taken to a Hindu temple about 100 yards from where we had our office, the UK High Commissioner. And suddenly, in the middle of the morning, I heard, as did others, frightful screams and going on. What happened was that the Hindus who were taken to this temple were butchered by Muslim crowds.
And if you were a Muslim in the north escaping west to Pakistan, your best chance was a train. But the train ran through Sikh territory. And the trainloads of Sikhs moving west were butchered by the Muslims, and the Muslims fleeing to West Pakistan were butchered by the Hindus. Maybe all this had to happen. But maybe if the British had not moved so quickly, some of these people might have lived.
I think it was a terribly rushed, and I think the haste was part of the great tragedy. that ensued. I think that had 6 months, had 9 months more been taken, it would have been much less traumatic, much less tragic.
He was compelled by the force of circumstances to do it as quickly as he could. He's been blamed for doing it perhaps a year too soon. He couldn't have held out for another year. That's to say, the government of India couldn't have held out on governing India in the way it had been governed for another year.
I had been a civil servant in quite a critical area, the United Provinces, the stronghold of the Nehru family, and I'd seen the political pressures. I'd seen my Indian colleagues in the civil service and in the police looking over their shoulders because, you know, what the hell was going to happen. But nevertheless, things had not totally collapsed. We were still going on, keeping things going, not as well as before, but there wasn't breakdown. And I felt at the time that the situation could have been controlled for a further 6 months or so.
The point is that the power was running out. We were facing a chaotic situation where nobody could give any instructions, nothing would happen. And indeed, the Punjab crisis that developed was a good example of that. It was a very, very grave crisis, but it could have been across the whole continent. That was the day. And so there was a need for hurry. But it is not a matter of us rushing the events were rushing ahead of us.
This is where Gandhi stayed in Calcutta, and it was here that he undertook his fast.
Maybe it was a miracle. Maybe it was only another of those Indian polar opposites. Calcutta was spinning into the same slaughter as the Punjab until Gandhi took the passions of the street and stood them on their heads. He said he would starve himself to death if the killing did not stop. The killing stopped. Maybe every one of the refugees who did not die was a miracle. Certainly Mountbatten's aides could shut their eyes and imagine millions more corpses by the side of the road, one for every Indian caught on the wrong side of the frontier. That did not happen. Judge Mountbatten, they say, for what he prevented.
It must be regarded as one of the historic achievements in the 20th century, because it was an event of enormous importance, symbolic importance, and the price of failure would have been so great. In other words, I think in dissecting this event, there was a real downside risk of enormous force. In other words, that although it was a flawed success in the sense that no success can be regarded as complete, which involves massacres of the scale that took place after it. I come back to the point that the alternative to what happened would have been a disaster of enormous implications for the future of democracy in Asia and of freedom throughout the world.
After this, the years after. This is what happened to some of the great figures of this time in India.
Namaste. You are late today.
Mahatma Gandhi had saved many lives, many Muslim lives, and many extremist Hindus hated him for that. On January 30th, 1948, he was murdered. Muhammad Ali Jinnah had carried a secret with him during all the hard argument before he won his state. He had tuberculosis. He was ill beyond treatment. He died in 1948. Jawaharlal Nehru led his country for another 17 years. He fought the caste system, fought for free education for India's children, reached out to other undeveloped nations to try to form a neutral third world. He died in office in 1964. Louis Lord Mountbatten returned to Britain and served with distinction as First Sea Lord and Chief of the Defense Staff. In August 1979, the IRA blew up his boat. He had left precise suggestions for his funeral. It was to be short and, of course, military. He thought the Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister spoke, might like to mention his efforts to help India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan fought 2 wars.
This one's going!
The Second War split East Pakistan, the old East Bengal, away from West Pakistan. East Pakistan became the independent state of Bangladesh.
But it was lowering the morale and...
Nehru's daughter became prime minister, moved against the Sikhs in the Punjab, and died of the old Indian plague of sectarian violence. A student of Hinduism has written that it is the reconciliation of extremes. That was the message of Mahatma Gandhi in his life and his death. But in the nation he fought for, the extremes are still alive. Hope and Hatred was produced by Paul Barber. This has been the Journal for Wednesday, December 23rd. Join us again tomorrow night. I'm Bill Cameron. Good night.